Hey everybody, it's Kevin and Zane. Super excited to see you guys. We were just talking about Zane's awesome guitar back there. And the next thing we're going to do is start a rock concert. Zane is just going to play for the next several hours, one thing after the next. I'm going to try to sing in between. No, we're not. This is the Healthcare Tech Show, and we're going to talk about open source. I'm going to play this reel and we'll be right back. All right, buddy. So open source, I mean, we were literally just jumping into this and talking about it right before the show. And we're like, hey, wait a second, we should probably save some of this for the show. When it comes to open source and what we want to get out of it and understanding it, we really thought, hey, let's try to do a neat little spin here and talk about the healthcare world. But I think first things first, buddy, like what is open source? I literally have the definition pulled up on this other screen, but walk us through it. Like, what is open source? How should we think about it from the software side of things first?
Yeah, so open source basically means that everyone has visibility to what they call the source code or how the program was created. It's kind of like walking into a house with no drywall on, right? Like you see exactly where the studs are, you know exactly where all the screws are. You can tell like, hey, maybe we need more studs over here because the roof might fall or whatever. So that's basically what open source is. It's just opening up the source code so everyone can, like the world can take a look at it. And then there's different licenses associated with. Some are, hey, we're open source, but you can't steal our source code, right? Or you can take parts of it, or you can use all of it. Like, hey, we're creating this project. Everyone can jump on board. You can create your own variants of it, or you can just help us out. And the thing about open source, which is great, is so I love open source. I've been part of, and I haven't physically been doing stuff in the open source community, but I've been using open source products for a very, very long time. And so I love the open source community for a couple of reasons. You have a bunch of people kind of pulling at the same side of the rope, and there's a lot of parallels with healthcare and open source, and we'll kind of get into that as well. So you have the whole world, huh?
What do you mean by lots of people pulling on the same side of the rope? Because I like that you said that, but break that down a little bit more.
Yeah, so you have let's say you're creating something, it's an open source project, and you have anyone in the world can take a look at your source code and be like, hey, have you thought about this? And then they can physically, I mean, if you're using things like GitHub and stuff, like they can literally take your source code, do a pull request, edit it, put it back, and then you can look at that, what they made with edits they make, and then add it to your code, right? I mean, that literally, like, depending on how popular your thing is, I mean, people have like hundreds of people looking at this code. And that's one thing about open sources, which I think is amazing with healthcare, is the transparency of open source, right? You know exactly what's going on, you know exactly where your data is going, how it's being stored, where it's going, why it's being used, like all this stuff is apparent to you. And then another thing is like generally speaking, like the open source software, I mean, I haven't looked into the data yet or anything like that. It is actually one thing that I'm going to be looking into for one of my articles is, generally speaking, it's a little bit more secure than like a closed source. And you're probably thinking like, how is that possible, right? Like everyone can literally see everything. Like we can poke holes in it. And that's literally why, because everyone can see everything. So somebody can look at it and be like, hey, you have a huge security issue here. Let's fix this right now, right? Versus like a closed source thing where it's like, okay, we got to wait, unless it's like a critical update, everything has its cycles or whatever. Like with open source, you can literally be updating and doing all that stuff within minutes. Like, so I use Linux as a primary desktop for like, I don't even know, for throughout college, throughout throughout pharmacy school, mainly because I was broke and cheap. But one thing about Linux was it, like if there was a security patch, it would literally come out within hours, and then you would have it, you would install it and go on your way. And that's the beauty of open source. So that's just a couple of reasons. And then and you can tell like why that would be amazing for healthcare is you have that transparency, you have that security, and then also you have rapid iteration and rapid movement because you have so many people working on this thing and getting excited for it. And you can have really amazing innovation, and a lot of some great innovation has come out of the open source community. That's just my little plug for open source. Everyone, please support the open source community.
Good plug. I mean, I think in general, like, so now that we know like open source is, like taking a house, instead of being a house, now we've got a bunch of Lego blocks and you can see where all the Lego blocks are. You can pull them, you can change the blocks out, you can make them different colors, you can make them different sizes, shapes, strengths, etc. Having that, like, super powerful. The one thing that you and I have both talked about is some of the, well, one thing, I guess, starting off, like our PH Ally, like getting in what Sean and I are really trying to do, adding Zane onto the team and the rest of the group is like, that's what I want it to be. Like, I want it to be open source. Like, if we're building stuff inside of healthcare and we're trying to build, here's one protocol, here's how one hospital is doing it, this is why one retail, chain is able to help their patients better than another, whatever it might be. It's just a beautiful thing to be able to think about. Can't we just all share, this information and just make iterations? And one thing I want to get into, Zane, we talked about the proprietary nature of open source, and some people thinking, well, if it's open source, that means everybody's got it and you don't have any differentiators. And that's not true, right? Because just because you can see the Lego blocks and you can build your own house doesn't mean you have to contribute back to the open source code. It means you can leverage it and utilize it and potentially put it behind a paywall. What are your thoughts, I guess, on that in general, and then educate us a little bit more, Zane, in that space?
Yeah. So in the open source, I mean, majority of things, open source is usually synonymous with free software. But does not always have to be the case, right? There are big open source projects that have led to a lot of companies making a lot of money, right? But the thing is, with open source, I think a lot of projects go free because, or let me back it up. So yes, open source does not necessarily mean it's free, right? Open source just means like your source code is out there, and depending on the license that you are allowing, people can play around with it, look at it, use it however they wish based on whatever the license is. So what a lot of companies are doing now is they have open source projects and they have a community edition, which is free, and it has majority of the bells and whistles, but not everything, right? And then they'll have an enterprise edition. So if you're a company, you have more than like 5-10 users, hey, you have to pay for it, right? So that's something that people are starting to do. Another thing that people are starting to do is they're doing like, hey, you're paying us for this. And then also there's a self-hosted version where you can host it on your own servers. It's free there, but if you're using our servers or whatever, you're paying us for that. And the third one, which is probably the most controversial, is, but it happens. And honestly, what they do is they take open source code, they make what they call like their own variant of it, whatever it happens to be, and then they make that behind a paywall. Be like, hey, we are based off of this source code, and we have added our own polish on top of it, made it look good. So not a lot, but like, this is where like big companies will come into play, where they'll donate to an open source project and then they'll make it look better, make it really function really well, all the bells and whistles, and then they'll start charging for it. It won't be as expensive as like a closed source project because they didn't do all the dev work, but they're still making money on it. So those are different ways that open source can be monetized. And I think that's one thing that really needs to be, just because something is open source doesn't mean that you are going to die a starving artist, right? I mean, the goal of the open source community is to share your knowledge and be free with your knowledge and just help everyone out, right? And again, kind of going back to healthcare, like how is healthcare done, right? We research something and then we share that with writing a paper or going to talks or whatever, and we openly share that information, right? And in the hopes that somebody else will find it valuable and then build off of it, right? That's exactly what open source is. Like, hey, I came up with the source code and then other people build off of it. Some people use exactly what you're using. Some people try different things. I mean, it's literally what medicine does. And that's how medicine has been evolved and moved so quickly. And I think that medicine and open source community are like a match made in heaven.
I think we have to become more and more like open source, Zane. I just don't think there's any way with the advancing levels of data and information that we're getting in and how algorithms and protocols are changing so rapidly. Like, this is working, this isn't, and not having at least some level of crowdsourcing for information to be able to come back and us to get good data so that we're saying, hey, great, like we pulled all this data in, we changed the way that we were doing things, and this is what we've recognized have been the outcomes for our patient population. I think is highly valuable. Yes, we're still going to be stuck in the fact that if you want to do this development, I'm trying to make some segues here. If you want to do this development, you're going to need these type of developers to do it, right? And that's the exact same thing of saying, this is how much this drug costs. This is how much it costs. This is how much this technology costs, whatever the case is in healthcare, to be able to implement for your patients. Like that's part of the system as it currently works. But I do think there are a ton of things that we are doing that are really interesting, cutting edge science on, hey, this is what we're doing to evaluate our patients when it comes to their pharmacogenomic profile. This is what we're changing in dietary modifications or adding on board with supplementation, et cetera, and can really help patients beyond what's happening inside of those confines, those siloed confines. It's funny, Maureen and I was just telling you this morning, we're talking about how plant-based medicine really made that shift over to purified, like chemical-based medicine, and how that was a big alteration on what was proprietary and what wasn't when it came to idea sharing. And so now I think that's more important than ever when it comes to. Donna Bartlett told me the other day, there's over like 750 seniors admitted to a hospital in the United States because of medication related issues. And so having more open source, like this is what isn't working for us, just as well as we're having this is what is working, I think would be really valuable insights to be able to share across the paradigm. And any other things, Zane, that you feel like we can learn from the open source community and do better inside of healthcare? Any other like specific examples?
Yeah, there's one actually after we got off the phone. I remembered. It's called OpenAPS, and it was a project created by some people with diabetes, type 1 diabetes specifically. So if people don't know, type 1 diabetes is when your pancreas is completely shut down and you are relying on external insulin to take care of you, right? Versus type 2 where it's kind of malfunctioning, it's not as good, right? So a lot of these patients have to wear a pump, right? So it's reading how much glucose is in your bloodstream and then it's calculating how much is going in and out, right? So they were having this problem where I don't exactly know how the company came about, but basically they created this open source pancreas. It's called OpenAPS. I think it's APS stands for like something pancreatic system or something like that. But yeah, they created the software, they created all the stuff, and then they released it to the world. And it was really interesting. They even go about how what hardware you need, and what you need to build, how you build it, all that stuff. And like this is a project. I mean, I think they're also FDA approved or going through FDA approval or something. They did studies. They went through the whole study process, got studies, got data, got everything.
Yeah.
And this is a alternative to like those really expensive glucose pumps, and you can build one of these and have the software for free. Like, I mean, that's a great example of kind of we talk about democratizing things and all this stuff, but what does it actually mean? There's a lot of words that get thrown around that people use as like dog whistles to get people to them, like health equity, or social terms of health, or democratizing care, democratizing this, let's democratize everything. What does it actually mean, and are you actually doing it? And I think that's one thing that is apparent with the open source community is when you say you're doing something, you can't hide behind anything because everyone is looking at exactly what you're building and how you're building it, right? And that's one thing that there's more, not scrutiny is not a good word, but there's more
transparency.
Yeah, that exists, and I think we need that in healthcare. Like, there's a lot of companies that say one thing and do another. There's a lot of bait and switches that happen in healthcare, unfortunately, but there's a lot of also good people that are in there. I'm not saying like not trying to paint with a broad brush, but just working there, you and I both know like all these things are said and none of it is delivered, and all that does is hurt the end users, which are patients, clinicians, hospital systems, and and it just burdens the system. And if we're truly talking about really helping people, like, let's actually put our money where our mouth is and actually help people. Let's stop with the jargon and all these buzzwords and stuff. Like, just tell me what you're doing, how you're doing it, and just show me.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's pretty powerful, buddy. I mean, that word like democratizing healthcare is a fascinating one, because as we were talking this morning, Marina brought up the point that a lot of us got into healthcare because we wanted a good job. Like, you want a job that makes money. And so I think that's one element of how do you take away from the proprietary nature and the commercialization of various products or various thinking or software, and be able to benefit humanity without actually making the profit, on the back end or having it be profitable. And so I think there's an interesting balance there. Thoughts on that balance and that overall divide, and where you think open source has taught us some things to be able to learn from.
I think you can do both, but it's just that we haven't figured out a good way to do both. We right now, it's either you're one or the other. I think there is a path to being able to provide affordable care, affordable things, and make money. And because I do believe, yes, you should be rewarded for what you're doing, what you're building. But like, there's also an excess to it, right? I mean, it's easy for me to say because I don't have that excess, right? I mean, I'm still in a very privileged position. I do have access compared to the majority of the country, but not that kind of access. So I think that there is I don't know how or what to do or how to do it, but there's definitely ways to do it. And there's definitely ways to monetize it to where it's not predatory, but it's just a matter of building a system that allows for that. And then one other thing with open source, and I think that there's got a lot of great things, but there are some negatives with open source as well, right? So, like when you have an open source project, these people aren't getting paid, right? Majority of them are not getting paid. So sometimes they abandon it. So you might be using something and it gets abandoned, and you're like, well, now what? And so like that's one thing with open source as well, right? And like also another thing is, not everyone in the open source community, not everyone is like coming in with the right intentions or whatever, but like it's easy to weed those kind of people out if your project is, being looked over by other people. But I love open source. I mean, even the one where, there are open source projects that have been dropped but picked up by other people, and it just continues on. So I mean, that's another, I guess, benefit of it as well. Like, just because it's stopped working or stopped being utilized or stopped being built on doesn't mean other people cannot build on top of it. So, but yeah, I mean, I think healthcare needs open source, and open source needs healthcare. I think not actually, open source doesn't need healthcare, but I think healthcare does need open source in the sense that it allows for rapid iteration, rapid movement, rapid what what we do in research, right? Like, research moves at a month. I mean, when you're doing the research, it doesn't seem like you're moving at a rapid pace. But if you really look at it from the outside looking in, we are moving at a very rapid pace, right? And the only reason for that is because knowledge is so easily shared nowadays, right? Back in the day, you would be in your little campus in your lab and be doing it, and no one would ever find out until you published a paper, 5-6 years later. Now people are finding out what you're doing as you're doing it, and with conferences and such, and and that's really, really moving the needle in healthcare in general.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll do this. I'm going to hold my tongue on how I think you can balance it, because I've got some thoughts and ideas, and I'd rather our audience be able to tell you and I, like, how do they think that we can balance the two? How can you commercialize and still have profit that's able to pay the workforce that's doing the work and putting it out there and benefiting humanity with it? Because I think that's a really important question that I'd love to hear a lot of smart minds that, thankfully, and thank you guys for watching our show, that watch it and comment. So that's fantastic. Other things I think on open source, and my last really components, Zane, are this. I think we can find ways to be able to share more information and more readily be vulnerable about what we have done and what we were doing in healthcare, without the legality, kind of behind it. Because I feel like that is one thing that open source has that we don't, is oftentimes we worry that if we share something and it is wrong, then, okay, well, you're not as intelligent, or you're not as successful, or you can't do these kind of things because you're harming patients, and there's going to be this, hungry mob that's coming after you. And I think that's one thing we've got to shake, one way, shape, or form, is the legality components and the judgment elements. Have ideas come out there. I mean, some of the best ideas I've heard, Zane, in my career have come from students.
Yeah.
No offense to you students. You guys are absolutely incredible. Medical students, nursing students, pharmacy students, everybody in the healthcare world that I've kind of encountered. But the brain is still soft and spongy, right? At that time, like, it's malleable. And they come up with really interesting ways to look at a system that I think are fascinating. And what ends up happening way too often, talking to you preceptors, of any way, shape, or form, if you are crushing the souls of students, shame on you, right? Just cultivate them. Find ways to be able to leverage what they're doing. So I think that's the piece that I would say from open source that I've really learned is that community is pretty willing to say, okay, this might need to be changed, but I like where this is going. And it seems to be, rather collegial in nature, and then just willing to build on top of things together. And I think that's where we can really make some headway inside of lots of systems inside of healthcare. Zane,
Yeah.
last comments to you.
No, I agree. And I think the reason why open source community is like that is because people are doing it following their passions. They're not doing it because they're forced to, right? So they're literally working on this project because they're passionate about it and they want it to succeed. And the only way you're going to succeed is you need help from others. I mean, there are bad actors. You'll go through these forums and there's like these know-it-alls that say like, oh, well, but I mean, that happens everywhere. That happens literally in healthcare too. So, but I think that's why the open source community is such a fun community. It's just that the passion that exists inside of the open source community is literally everything is driven by passion and nothing else.
I love it. I love it. Well, fantastic, everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you for the comments that we've received in here. And if you guys have any questions, shoot them over to Zane and I. Make sure you're checking out Digital Thoughts. Zane just put out a fantastic article today. So make sure that you read that. He's got podcasts coming out all the time. Jump over on the RPH Ally channel. And, let's do that. If Zane and I can do anything on the RPH Ally Healthcare Tech channel, let's make it open source, bring in some really good ideas. I know there's lots of good communities out there, but let's make it another one. All right, guys, have a good rest of the day, and we'll talk to you sometime soon. And festive guy with beard, we'll talk to you very soon, buddy.
Bye.